Next presentation now. The Brazilian Studies Association at Harvard Law School is honored to have here Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, which is a professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School. She's a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She's also a former professor at the Queen's College, University of Oxford, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Professor Gordon-Reed is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So without further ado, I turn over to Professor Gordon-Reed for her lecture on race, discrimination, and democracy.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me? Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here as a person who studies the institution of slavery. Obviously, the United States and Brazil have much in common on that score. There are many differences. The slave trade went on longer in Brazil. Many more Africans were brought to Brazil than were brought to the United States of America. And there's been a different progression of the politics and democracy in the United States than in Brazil. My work centers on the colonial period in America and actually the revolution in the early American Republic, roughly the 1600s up until Andrew Jackson. One of the difficult parts of the American story is a question of how to incorporate people who did not come to the country voluntarily, but came as a result of enslavement. There was never any notion from the very beginning that blacks were going to be a part of American society, an equal part of American society. They had been brought to the continent to work. And the European settlers, particularly the British, I'm speaking now of the British colonial America, did not really have a place for them other than as chattel during the early days. The American Revolution, which saw the Americans break from Great Britain, gave them an occasion to think about what they wanted to do with the new society that they were going to create. They were on the American continent with enslaved Africans and Native Americans, the people whose land they were determined to have, the people who had died in large amounts of numbers upon contact with Europeans from various diseases. So the British had their own kinds of relations with Native Americans and were making deals to prevent westward expansion or quick westward expansion. The colonists had in mind that they wanted westward expansion. The British, once the hostilities broke out between the United States, what would become the United States, promised freedom to enslaved African Americans who would join the British forces. So once this battle came to the fore, it was apparent to the Americans that they had to deal with this situation of three different groups of people on the continent who all had, in some ways, oppositional relationships with one another. There were, in fact, Native Americans and African Americans who fought on the Patriot side. But there's a very important book by a man named Robert Parkinson called The Common Cause. And he talks about how even during the American Revolutionary War, as early as this time period, the European Americans began to separate, to sort of enunciate the principle of separation between whites, blacks, and Native Americans. Through newspapers, they sent the stories of blacks and Native Americans who were working on the British side, constructing them essentially as internal enemies. the Revolutionary War was defined in this way as a struggle for the benefit of European Americans, with Native Americans outside of the circle, African Americans outside of the circle, and as enemies. This was despite the fact, as I said, some Native Americans and some African Americans were fighting on the Patriot side, but the newspapers did not report that in the way that they reported stories of atrocities, and in some instances made up atrocities. Benjamin Franklin very notoriously made up a massacre that was supposedly carried out by Native Americans, and this kinds of thing fueled the imaginations and the feelings of the patriots who were reading these newspaper articles. I mean, we think of technology today, tweeting, social media, all of those kinds of things shape public opinion. In those days, the newspaper, Parkinson shows very clearly, I think, very persuasively, that this reinforced this idea that blacks were alien, Native Americans were alien, and instead of focusing on a story where some of these people were actually working with the patriot cause, possibly people who could be incorporated into the American story, these stories drove people apart, were designed to drive people apart. Now, what was the reason for doing this? You could say that it was, well, certainly race and racism was a part of that, but Parkinson makes the claim that this was a matter of expediency. 13 colonies who were very, very different. It's hard for us to imagine now. We think of the United States of America as one country. But think of what it was like when there were 13 different colonies, very different cultures, different religious sensibilities. How do you bind those 13 colonies together? And Parkinson makes the claim, and again, I think he's quite persuasive, that race, organizing on the basis of race, racial fears, actually served as a glue to hold 13 disparate colonies together so that they could mobilize and fight against Great Britain. So here you have an instance of race being used to separate people, people who, even if African Americans believed the things that the patriots were saying, wanted to be a part of the effort, they were kept out of it. Now, we have to understand that most African Americans at this time were enslaved, so it really was not in the interests of colonists to see them as compatriots, because how can you be compatriots with people who are your slaves? So the people who participated in the Continental Army, those, patriot militia and so forth, were people who were already freed for some reason or were promised their freedom individually if they participated in the effort. So how do you get a group of people who are, by law, outside of the polity into the polity? So the war is the beginning, as Rob shows, I think persuasively, of constructing America and Americans as white. Native Americans are out, African Americans are out. After the war is won, some of the sentiments that were put forth in what is called the American Creed, the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, talk about the right to the pursuit of happiness. Those kinds of things led some of the colonists to say, we should outlaw slavery. Massachusetts, the state that we're in, outlawed slavery as best we can tell by interpretation of their constitution. There was not separate legislation. They basically said the free and equal clause in our constitution means that slavery should be abolished, that slavery is against, against humanity, that it's not a humane thing. And other states in the North began to pass gradual emancipation statutes. The South liberalized emancipation laws. Virginia, for the first time, provided for the private emancipation of enslaved people in 1782, meaning that individual masters could free slaves. Before, you had to get permission from the state in order to free people. Now, this is thinking of, it's a liberalization of emancipation rules, but it's also part of the merging capitalism that recognizes property rights and saying that owners have a right to do what they wish with their property, even emancipate property, property in people. So the revolution changes attitudes about slavery a lot more in the North than in the South, because the North was a society that had slaves. The South was a slave society. In other words, the society revolved around the institution. In every colony there were enslaved people, but many, many more in the southern part of the United States. So there's a change in attitude about the institution of slavery, but because slavery was racially based, there's still a problem. There's still a problem for free African Americans in the United States. There's a problem, obviously, for enslaved people. So we come to the point where the colonies are trying to form a government. And as I'm sure you may know, there was some difficulty between the North and the South in determining how to construct the Union. There were critiques of slavery, and the Southerners refused or to have take any kind of pullback from the institution, and it resulted in the creation of compromises in the Constitution. The 3/5 clause that counted enslaved people as 3/5 of the person for purposes of the representatives in the House of Representatives. A fugitive slave clause, which said that if enslaved people escaped to the North, they could be brought back. Essentially, the North agreed to do that, to allow that to happen, which is obviously a compromise with slavery that recognizes the property interests of Southerners. And we could not, the general consensus is we could not have had a United States Constitution without that compromise. Now, some people said, well, let them go. If they didn't want to join the Union, see how you feel. If you're there, South Carolina, you're there, fighting against Great Britain, you'll be on your own. But that was not what they wanted. They wanted a union, and they came together with those two compromises and another one that prevented the abolition of the slave trade until 1808. So with those three compromises, the United States was formed and went forward as under a constitution that protected slavery, and much to the chagrin of a number of people. From there, you get the sense that you can see the kind of acquiescence in racially based slavery across the country. The first Naturalization Act of 1790 provided that only free white people could migrate to the United States of America, so could become citizens. So there you get a sense of this idea of America as a white nation, a nation of white citizens. Even though the talk of the Declaration is inspiring a number of African Americans to fight for their rights, to argue against slavery. Here in Massachusetts and Boston, there were active anti-slavery movements, not just with blacks, but with whites who agreed with them. So the revolution doesn't solve the problem of slavery, obviously. The revolution doesn't mandate that racial equality, even though it talked about all men are created equal. The founders, the white founders, this generation of people, considered themselves to be men of the Enlightenment, and we are talking mainly about men who were forming the government. They considered themselves to be men of the Enlightenment, and they saw slavery as a necessary evil. Now, that is something that we have trouble with, because if it's an evil, why must it be necessary? Isn't there something else that you could do? Aren't there other ways that you could construct society? Did it have to be constructed on this notion of chattel slavery? But that generation, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, all of these people wrote of slavery as an evil and considered themselves to be anti-slavery. Now, there's a lot of discussion today when we talk about the founders, and this would be something interesting to hear about Brazil. If you have a group of people who are considered founders in the way that Americans go on and on and on about our founders, they consider this, as I said, a necessary evil. They consider themselves to be anti-slavery. And today, people question that because they think this is just a ruse, that you're trying to make yourself look enlightened, but you actually aren't enlightened. So the revolutionary generation doesn't solve the problem of slavery. The person that I write about most often, Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, is most often looked at as the person who is hypocritical because of his stance, because of what he wrote in Notes in the State of, what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, what he wrote in a book called Notes on the State of Virginia, in which he criticizes slavery very, very heavily and talks about the malign influence that slavery has on whites, essentially. I mean, he talks about injustice to blacks, but his main focus is on what it does to whites, the character of white people. At the same time, in Notes on the State of Virginia, we see Jefferson engaging in what some people consider to be the beginning of scientific racism in America. He is, I guess I could say, influenced by, some people say that you could tell the last book Jefferson read by some of the arguments that he makes. He was reading a man named Edward Long, who'd written a history of Jamaica, and it talks about the differences between Africans and Europeans and the inferiority of African people. Jefferson repeats these things in Notes on the State of Virginia. He says he ventures it as a suspicion only that African Americans were inferior to whites. Now, he says a suspicion. I actually think he didn't suspect it. I think he thought it. But trying to be scientific, he expresses this notion. He frames it in terms of skepticism, that he's skeptical about it. But he clearly believes that this is the case. So these words become known to people during the time period. It's not that Jefferson did not invent racism in America, but he is the first person in a book, I should say, first famous person to muse out loud about this question and moving things beyond the issue of slavery and going squarely to the question of race. And this is a problem because Jefferson and his cohort, the founders that we talk about, even though they thought that slavery was wrong, they also believed that emancipation, while they believed that emancipation should come to the United States, emancipation should be followed by expatriation. Black people should be freed in the United States, but they should go somewhere else. They should be forced to go somewhere else. His plan was to educate blacks, men until 21, women till 18, and then find some place to colonize them. The United States would help them for a few years, and then they would be on their own. And when he's talking about all men are created equal, he's thinking at this point that at that juncture, blacks in their own country could meet Americans as equals in that way, but not in the United States. There was no thinking that there could, in fact, be a multiracial society. He said, we can't live here together, and this is, again, not just Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Marshall, other people, famous founders at that time, believed that that was the liberal solution, emancipation, expatriation, because we cannot live together. Blacks would never forgive whites for what they'd done. He says that slavery destroyed the amor patriae of Africans, African Americans. How can you love a country where you had been enslaved? He said, and this is what Freud would call this sort of transference. Basically, he's saying, this is how I would feel if I were in this situation. And so blacks would never forgive whites. He says whites would never give up their prejudices against black people, and we would be, and he said, and he says, you know, there can't be any intermixture. He said, in Rome and other places and ancient civilizations when there was slavery, they essentially just assimilated, and then the people disappeared. After slavery was over, they could be joined. The master and slave could be joined together as one people. He said, we can't have that here. Now, you may or may not know that that's a particularly ironic thing for Jefferson, because Jefferson had for 38 years a liaison, connection, whatever it is we want to call this, with an enslaved woman on his plantation, a woman named Sally Hemings, with whom he had 7 children, and 4 of them lived to adulthood. Sally Hemings was, in fact, the half-sister of his wife. So there were 2 generations of this sort of mixture going on. So he knew very, very well that interracial mixture happened within slavery, that it would be possible to have that kind of mixing. And in fact, in Virginia, in his state, if you were 7/8 white, you were considered a white person. So he knew that it was possible through breeding people, I'm using that word breeding is unfortunate, through mixture with people, to create, to have a person essentially breed black people out. But he rejected that idea. That's not something that he could write in a book in the 1780s or the 1790s. That would not have been, he would not have been a politician. He would never have been president. He would never have risen to the heights that he rose if he promoted that kind of idea, even though in his home life, and it was pretty well known in his area that in an area where this kind of thing happened, that he had this connection to this woman and had these children, whom he frees when they get to be adults, and 3 of them eventually live as white people, and 1 remained in the black community, even though he could have lived as a white person during this time period. So this is a complicated world where you have this institution, again, with this group of people who are seen as unassimilable, but in fact are being assimilated in some ways, but nobody knows how to deal with the question of race and whether or not the United States could ever become a country of one people, one blood, one group. Now, strangely enough, with Native Americans, and you may not say strangely enough, given a sense of racial hierarchy, he had no problem with proclaiming that Native Americans and whites could marry and become one people. He offers the choice to them. He basically says, you can be assimilated, we will be one family, our blood will mingle in our veins, but you have to change. You have to become European farmers in the way that we farm. You have to take the women out of the fields, put them in the home. You have to live like European farmers, even though Native Americans farmed. It was just a different way of farming. But he said, once you become European-like, once we mix together, everything will be okay. We can get along, but you have to become assimilated. So blacks are unassimilable openly. Native Americans are openly assimilable. So, and I'm telling you this in the terms of Jefferson because he's the person who's talking about this and we know the most about him. But these ideas were common among the founders during his time period. They don't really know how to deal with this situation other than saying that blacks are not a part, obviously not a part of the government, that obviously not citizens. I mean, in southern places, black people who were free were considered denizens. They lived there, but they did not have the full group of rights that a real citizen would have. Even in the North, there were some limitations on black citizenship. So this question of race and democracy was decided by being in this kind of weird stasis where, well, enslaved people were clearly out of the polity. Free blacks were somewhat in a sort of a gray zone of a hazy zone of citizenship but not citizenship. Something happens around the 1820s. There's a dispute over the entry of a state into the Union, slave states versus free states. It becomes apparent that the westward expansion might upset the balance of power between the North and the South. The betting was that most states were going to become Southern, that more the population would grow in the South. But that's not what happened. People who were coming to the United States from Europe and other places did not want to live in a slave society. So they were going north. The North was a place of family farms, free labor. The South, people wanted to go west, but they wanted to go west, seek their fortunes, take slaves, take land, and become like the Southern grandees. That's the American dream in the North and the South were two different things. Sectional conflict rises to the fore. Abolitionists, people who are opposed to the spread of slavery, began to say African Americans should be freed. Massachusetts is the hotbed of this kind of activity, the locus of this kind of activity. African Americans should be freed and they should become citizens. The democracy should contain everybody. The South pushes back against that, and for the first time, unlike the revolutionary generation that had talked about slavery as a necessary evil, a generation of people, Jefferson's grandchildren, they began to say, no, slavery is a positive good. We're going to solve this problem of democracy, of American democracy, by keeping African American people enslaved. Africans were made to be slaves. It's good for them. It's good for our society, and we're going to go forward with that. So that's, you know, as much as we criticize the founding generation for their hypocrisy, this is a different level. This is not bad. This is good, and we're going forward with it. And this is the way Africans should live. And this is how, as I said, we're going to solve our democracy, our problem here. We're going to keep them under our control, keep them as a part of a permanent underclass. You think about how this works, how this helps the class system in America, how poor whites can say, you know, it doesn't make any difference if I don't have anything. It doesn't make any difference if I'm poor. At least I'm not black. At least I'm not a slave. So America has long had, is sort of famously known for a sort of disinclination to talk about class, because race has been the dividing line, and poor whites see themselves as part of a superior race, a race that has privileges. And so to talk about things in terms of class, to talk about solidarity with black people is anathema to them. And very often throughout American history, you can see whenever those groups have tried to form through populist movements or whatever, race is introduced to this, and the whole thing falls apart. The racial allegiance holds even over economic development. If you look at the southern part of the United States, it really is in some ways a story about a region that would rather be behind than to accept government support or to accept public education, public services, those kinds of things, so long as, you know, I don't want a road if that means the black person gets to be on the road. And so it's really cutting off your nose to spite your face. So this stuff starts very, very early on in America, and is a feature, you can consider this to be sort of a legacy of the time period that I'm talking about here. People deciding things sometimes against their own economic interest to maintain a sense of racial solidarity. So once this battle gets joined between the abolitionists and other people, abolitionists and the people in the South who are arguing for the actual rightness of slavery, things escalate to the point that there's a sectional crisis and a war. And what the Civil War does in America is to bring us 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, particularly the 14th Amendment, that makes African American citizens. if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States, birthright citizenship. And that brings 4 million people who had been enslaved and outside of the polity into the polity. At enormous struggle, the loss of 500,000 lives in the Civil War, the destruction of the South, and a period after that that was hopeful, that we thought you could take those amendments and other laws, and blacks did prosper at this time period. They actually began to be a part of the American government. They developed the capacity to buy land. Things were doing well for a time under Reconstruction, and then it fell apart as the North and the South, whites in the North, whites in the South, sought reconciliation and essentially left African Americans behind. And we were in this moment of Jim Crow, of lynching and racial discrimination, all the things that Jefferson said. Jefferson talked about the possibility of a race war if there were emancipation without expatriation. And he gets criticized for that, but if you look at what happened after, it's been a struggle, a definite struggle. And we don't get this question, this issue of black citizenship as a question to be solved again until what we call the Second American Revolution and the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and the 1960s, which finally used the 14th Amendment to ensure voting rights, public accommodations, and all kinds of things that we know about this movement for civil rights, the things that we consider to be the victories. We're in a moment now where the issue of citizenship is back to the fore. It's very difficult in a country where you don't have a national religion, you don't have 1,000 years of a group of people mixing together and forming a culture. America is supposed to be about an ideal that's expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And at the same time, there's still that pull, to a sort of atavistic pull, to blood and this notion of citizenship based upon blood. And even though it's not so much about, well, it's more openly now about immigration to the United States of America, with the new administration in office that's taken a very, very hard line on that question, the issue of black rights is still at the fore. This is something that we've been talking about. I don't want to make it sound like we haven't made any progress, because we definitely have. But the central issue of what it means to be an American, who is an American, who can claim those citizenship rights in a democracy, have been with us from the beginning, and it's something that we're still struggling over today. So with that, I would like to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Professor. So I would like to remind the audience that you can send your questions using this website Slido and the code Harvard Law Brazil. So we have some questions here about the Supreme Court, for example. You mentioned some historical moments in which the Supreme Court played a crucial role, such as the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. And we tend to think about the Supreme Court as the savior, as the branch of the government who will take care of the minorities to protect them from the oppression from the majority. But in those historical moments, we can think about the Supreme Court as acting to the detriment of the minorities. For example, Dred Scott, the decision about the civil rights acts from the late 19th centuries, Plessy, and then many moments in which we expected from the Supreme Court to be to shield these groups, and then they just permitted the oppression. So how can we understand the role of the judiciary and the context of race discrimination.
Yes, particularly in places like Harvard. When I was here, my professors were always very, very much into federal judges because they had all clerked for federal judges. And they thought that federal judges, with the Supreme Court at the top, they thought of them as being saviors. And during that era, it had been most of the people clerked, it had been the Warren Court, the court that expanded civil rights and so forth, and criminal, rights for criminals, rights for minorities, and for women and so forth. But the court is a political body. The court is picked by politicians, and so it really, really matters who gets into office. And I think you're right. For a long time, particularly people, I would say, on the left or liberals, relied on the court quite a bit to solve problems, and perhaps neglected the kind of politics that you have to do in local governments, state houses, House of Representatives, the Senate, because the president, whoever gets elected to the presidency, picks the Supreme Court. And there's no question that the president can shape the judiciary and shape the values of the judiciary. I teach criminal procedure, and the Warren Court decisions, which expanded rights in lots of ways, when we get the Berger Court, constricts them, the Rehnquist Court constricts them. We'll see what with Roberts Court, we can't, it's hard to know exactly where. It's definitely more conservative, but it's been much more of a mixed bag. So the Supreme Court is not a savior. What people have to do in a democracy is to participate, and waiting for a judge or judges to save you is not going to be the answer. You have to get out and do the hard work of politicking, voting, paying attention to those kinds of things that matter to you, because you can't count on them to be the saviors of the minority. The minorities they may save may be the economic minorities, that is to say rich people who fear themselves to be under siege. And that's really been the story of a lot of the Supreme Court, is the protection of powerful economic minorities. Not, when we think of minorities, blacks or poor people who are not,
We also have a couple of questions that I think we can merge into only one. So because we had that time of enlightenment, and in which maybe paradoxically slavery was very popular in that era. So, and do you think that, so first, what is the reason for that? And second, do you think that the history of racial discrimination taints the democratic spirit of the U.S. Constitution?
I think the Enlightenment was a mixed bag. There are great things about the Enlightenment, and I support the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment and its faith in science and its faith in categorization, particularly categorization, help fuel the kind of scientific racism that I talked about before. You put everything in a hierarchy. You put everything in a list, in a category. So we get the great chain of being, where you have European race at the top, and Pacific Islander, so some group of people on the very, very bottom. So the Enlightenment is generally good, but it gave an opening for people to think about difference and to think about hierarchy, because that's what they did, not just in terms of race, but other things, just listing things, putting it in categories. I think does it taint the Constitution, the racial? Well, yeah, it does. I think certainly the Constitution of 1789, which was remade after the Civil War, those two documents are very, very different. I mean, the compromise that was made to allow slavery and to protect slavery, a man named William Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution, it's a deal with the devil, essentially. It's the devil's bargain. And destroyed a copy of it, of the Constitution, you know, as a symbolic of his feelings about it. So I think it taints it, but it doesn't destroy it. I think the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, after the Civil War amendments, redeem it in significant ways. What we don't do as much, when I mentioned before this sort of founder worship that we have, we don't pay enough attention to the people who did that. The sort of second founding of the United States, when we brought blacks into citizenship, outlawed slavery in the 13th Amendment, blacks into citizenship in the 14th Amendment, and the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. We don't know, most people don't know the people who drafted those. We don't know the people who, you know, fought for those kinds of things. So there's much more attention on the 1789 Constitution and what it got right and what it got wrong, without realizing that we're not living under that one anymore. We're living under the second one. The 14th Amendment didn't just transform black people's lives. It transformed all Americans' lives, giving rights, a source of rights for women, for the LGBT community, everybody. And it's not enough of a celebration of that. We tend to look at the beginning, at the very beginning, and that one is flawed. There's no question that document is flawed.
There are also some questions here about affirmative actions,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very hot topic in Brazil as well.
Oh, really?
And yes, the Supreme Court of Brazil has ruled constitutional affirmative actions that ensure that there's a quota system in universities for African Brazilians, an actual quota. And this is what the Supreme Court here said, that is not allowed, that race should be considered in the context of the application. So do you want to comment on these questions? And affirmative actions, generally, what is the role of affirmative actions to change this reality?
Well, it's interesting because affirmative action, I mean, I support affirmative action. Quotas are not something that would fly here with strict numbers. I think either for racial reasons or for women, we just don't like the precision of that, or a mandate of that. But there are two basic reasons advanced for affirmative action, and one is as some sort of compensatory notion of paying people back for discrimination in the past. The other is a sort of realization, and I think this is the one that seems more reasonable to me, one that I think is more urgent, is if you don't have some kind of affirmative action, people fall back into the habits of my friends, the people I know, the people in my community, because it's the easiest thing to do. You really do have to work to break out of that mold, to try to see other people who might be able to do the job or be in the school or whatever. So I support it, and I think certainly, and I think because of this, the tendency of inertia or to fall back on old networks and so forth, if you don't have some prod, if some people are not really looking at you saying, if you're I'm on book prize committees, and you end up with 10 guys, and then like surely there are other people out there, 10 guys that you know, people who have already demonstrated their prowess or whatever, or known to you for some reason. You got to look for other things. So I support that. I just think it's very, very hard in a society where you have different races, different groups of people, to break out of patterns that replicate themselves over and over again. So I think that that's critical, and I think people in business and other places, I mean, business in America, they're the sort of biggest boosters of this, because they understand that it's better to have diverse teams, diverse groups of people who have different perspectives, who can bring different ideas to the table. So it's funny, you typically think of business as conservative. The people who are anti-affirmative action are conservative. Business in America are the biggest boosters of this because they have seen it work, and it's very, very important to them.
It's interesting because in Brazil, actually, I think that half of the companies are run by blacks in Brazil, and this is very impressive. So because I think this is a gate for social improvement of these minorities, and many people are asking about some forms of discrimination that, despite these advancements, still happen in our society, such as police violence. There's the problem of disenfranchisement, and also, although slavery is in our past, there's still now labor that can be compared to slavery. How do you think we could address these issues, and especially how can law help to overcome these hurdles?
Well, I can speak of the United States. The first Africans come to British North America. It's so funny, we never think about the Spanish in the southern part of the United States, San Augustine and places. They've been there since the 1500s. But the first blacks get here, commonly said, 1619. Slavery ends in 1865. And then we have a period of Jim Crow and segregation, no legal freedom, as you could say, to vote and do those kinds of things until 1965. The period of time of the creation of this sense of a racial hierarchy, of a society that's based upon slavery was much longer than the period that we're in now. The notion that you can, just like that, get rid of habits, thoughts, ideas that were embedded in the society, I think is a little naive. It's very, very hard. The only thing that you can do is to keep plugging at it. The case has to be made, and people have to fight against oppression. When you say there is you may have known or may have seen that there was an incident here night before last that has now gone. I saw it in the Washington Post today about a young man, a Harvard student, who was in an altercation with police officers, and this is under investigation at this point. These are hard feelings to conquer. We've come a long way. I grew up in the South, and I integrated our school system. So I can remember a time when I went to the movie, I had to sit in the balcony, and white sat wherever they wanted to sit, or went to separate waiting rooms, a white waiting room and a black waiting room. Law changed that. It's a much more open society when I go home now, but the economic situation is pretty much the same. Socially, it's better, but economically, the problems are still there. So I don't, if I had an answer to that, I'd be in Stockholm getting my prize. But all I can think is that you just have to strike at any time you see it. One thing that has to happen, I think, and I will say this, is that white people have to challenge this. The only time we've made any progress in the United States is when white people turn to their family members, their friends, and say, whatever we're getting out of this, this is wrong. Because, black people can't, and we shouldn't have to, convince people that we're human beings. That is something that white people have to see. And the only people, I think, who have a realistic possibility of making people see that is other white people.
And I always abuse a little bit of my powers as a moderator, so I want to ask a question of my own, because okay. I think you're such a great speaker, a great scholar. And how do you think we can have more Annette Gordon-Reeds in the academia?
Oh, there are many Annette Gordon-Reeds. What we have to do is, in academia, is to convince them not to become lawyers. The problem is really smart, good black students, when they're in college, they go to medical school. They go to law school, and they go to law school to practice. They don't go to law school to teach. So academia has to, I think, have more outreach to people to make people understand that being an academic is a good life in a lot of ways. And they're out there. It's just that we have to channel them to this a bit more effectively than we do, because they start businesses, they become doctors, investment bankers, make a fortune or whatever. But I'd like to see more people in the classroom. This is a good question. Thank you.
So please, a round of applause for Professor Annette.